There is human trafficking going on in every single state.
We're seeing this around the world.
Tens of millions of people in this situation.
Forced to labor against their will.
Slavery can be found at all levels of the supply chain.
From agriculture to construction, multinational corporations, local businesses, there's no regulation.
Businesses have a huge power.
Consumers can play a very active role in ending human trafficking and slavery.
Hi, my name is Julie Fernandez. Thank you for joining this webcast on the world of modern-day slavery and human trafficking. Today we're exploring the connection between labor intermediaries and modern-day slavery. All too often, labor intermediaries are the critical agents promoting employment schemes designed to exploit vulnerable workers. In these schemes, there's often the promise of lucrative work, but the reality is far different. This webcast will also introduce you to solutions, and you'll meet a victim of labor trafficking who's now an advocate. First, I want to let you know this webcast is an interactive affair with a live chat that we hope you will join as the discussion continues. Experts in the world of labor brokers and slavery are standing by to answer questions and amplify this program. Which brings me to my guest today. Joining us in a special one-on-one interview is Ima Matul, who came to the U.S. from Indonesia at age 17 when she was forced into domestic servitude. Now a mother of 3 who works full-time for a law firm, Ima is a leader in a peer support program for survivors of human trafficking. Ima, thank you for joining us. I'm also pleased to introduce Stephanie Richard, Policy and Legal Services Director at the Coalition Against Slavery and Trafficking. Stephanie is familiar with Ima's story and will interview her for us. Here on the set with me, we have Holly Burkhalter, Vice President of Government Relations at the International Justice Mission, an organization committed to comprehensive care of those who are often victimized by labor brokers. Next, we have Sean McDonald, Director of Programs and Research at Verite, an independent auditor of corporate labor practices. Finally, and immediately to my left, is Neha Mishra of the Solidarity Center, an organization committed to building a global labor movement. Neha's organization put together a short video that might help our discussion today. Neha, what are we about to see?
Morning, Julie. We're going to see this video shows Solidarity Center's work in Thailand with Burmese migrant workers who are working in shrimp processing and seafood processing plants that export to the United States. And unfortunately, as we'll see in this video, they face trafficking, forced labor, and other forms of modern-day slavery.
Great. Thanks, Neha. Let's roll the video.
About an hour southwest of Bangkok, the province of Samut Sakhon is vital to Thailand's seafood industry. Thailand is the world's leading exporter of canned tuna and frozen shrimp, and seafood exports total 1.4 million tons, worth over $4 billion annually. The workers here in Mahachai, both those on the boats, those at the dock, and those who work in processing plants, share some common characteristics. They are all dependent on one another to maintain Thailand's bustling seafood trade, and thus their own livelihoods. And they're almost all migrants, mostly from neighboring Burma. Many migrants find life in Samut Sakhon to be arduous. Numerous studies note long hours, low pay, and hazardous working conditions. A web of powerful labor brokers and complicit companies and police often combine to intimidate legally vulnerable migrants. Labor rights abuses in the province gained both national and international attention in late 2006, when a shrimp processing factory in Samut Sakhon was raided by local police, uncovering awful living conditions and workers trapped inside what was described as a fortress. Workers noted a heavily armed guard force, shifts lasting up to 20 hours, unpaid labor, and physical intimidation. These workers got their day in a Thai labor court and settled their case with their former employer. Despite being called into a labor court to answer allegations of human trafficking, criminal charges are still being investigated, and no further charges have been brought against the owner.
Neha, thanks for providing that video to help us understand what was going on with the shrimp industry in Thailand. Can you give us a little context for that?
Sure. The video actually shows something that is common around the world. We're increasingly seeing in supply chains and in factories and other workplaces around the world, migrant workers being used to produce products, and there's a strong demand for cheap labor that fuels this, and companies are using labor brokers to find workers to fill these jobs, and unfortunately they often get abused. And as we saw in that video, the demand for cheap prices for shrimp fueled a demand for cheap labor, and the way they filled that in Thailand was through Burmese migrant workers who are very vulnerable. These Burmese migrant workers are lured by labor brokers who promise them a good job with good wages, and when they get to the workplace, they find that the conditions are not what they were promised. They often had to pay huge fees to the labor brokers, and those fees put them in a condition of debt bondage, where when the conditions are bad, exploitative, their passports are taken, they're not paid what they were promised, the working conditions are difficult and dangerous, they can't leave because they owe huge amounts of debt to the labor broker. And as I was saying, unfortunately, we're seeing this around the world, not just in Thailand. We also see it in the United States. And we see it in every sector, from agriculture to construction to hotels, domestic work, etc.
Well, how are labor brokers or labor intermediaries, how are they regulated now?
Unfortunately, they're not regulated very much anywhere, including in the United States. It's an industry that is basically free to do what they want. And increasingly, we're seeing employers, multinational corporations, local businesses, using labor brokers to find this cheap labor that I was talking about. And there's no regulation. Anyone can basically sign up to become a labor broker in the United States or around the world. So there's very, very little regulation that happens right now, and I think that's partly why we're increasingly seeing labor brokers play a role as traffickers.
Let me turn now to Sean McDonald from Verite. Sean, can you tell me a little bit first just about Verite's work in this area?
Sure. Verite is an NGO that's based here in the U.S., but we work all over the world. And what we've found in the past 15 years or so, when we've been doing research or conducting audits in factories and farms, is that a common denominator where you find some of the worst conditions, the most vulnerable workers, is this debt bondage situation that Neha describes so well, where people have had to pay brokers, sometimes more than one broker, to find that job, and then very often their wages are garnished. They've had to pay exorbitant fees for their housing, for their food. And so what we're really trying to do, as well as a lot of the other organizations that are part of the Attest Network, is really shine a light on these practices and really make sure that as people are looking to see what companies are doing to be more transparent about trafficking and slavery in their supply chains, to look specifically at this labor broker mechanism. So if you are buying your shrimp from a certain shrimp processing facility in Thailand, you're buying your clothes from a factory in Indonesia, your metals are coming from a place in Africa, not just looking at are the wages being paid, but saying how are those people getting recruited there? Mm-hmm. Are they paying a fee? It's against most laws for workers to be paying a fee. Why are poor, vulnerable people paying a fee to get a job? The factory, the farm should be paying the price to recruit and hire people.
So what works in a solution to this problem? What are the kind of mechanisms that can work to better ensure that the labor brokers aren't engaging in these kind of practices? Mm-hmm.
Well, what we see is a lot of calls for governments to have genuine regulation of this industry. So it's not just incorporating or being able to change your name if you're found out to be doing something illegal. Obviously, consumers, governments, others can really put a lot more emphasis on corporate supply chains, specifically asking about what they're doing about labor brokers. Very often, labor brokers are necessary to help match people between a job and someone seeking a job. Mm-hmm. But very often they're not. What's happening is factories or farms are being approached by brokers to say, I can find you a worker from Burma, and then that enables the company to make more money without having to pay for it. And then they're not looking into it. We need to demand that companies take responsibility for how workers find their way into the factories and onto the farms that are making their work. And a lot of tools exist. Our organization has a toolkit that all sorts of companies, as well as other stakeholders, be they unions or investors or governments, can really better understand some practical ways that this problem can be tackled.
Holly, I want to talk to you next, but first, my colleague Stephanie Richard has a survivor of labor trafficking on the line via Skype video. Stephanie, do you want to take it from here?
Thanks so much, Julie. That's right. I have Ima Matul with me here today. She's a member of the Caste Survivor Advisory Caucus, and she's going to talk a little bit about her experience and other survivors' experience as a survivor of modern-day slavery and the labor brokers that recruited them. Ima?
Hi. Thank you for having me here. And I'm a survivor of labor trafficking for 3 years, and I'm also an active member of the Survivor Caucus. And since I joined the caucus, I learned a lot about other survivors too, how they came here and how they have to pay like recruitment fee. And for example, I know them personally, like two person that I know that in order for them to pay off their recruitment fee, they have to pay $10,000, and they have to work for 10 years to pay off their debt. And on top of that, besides the debt bondage that they owe to their trafficker, they also receive a threat. And, in my personal case, the threat was that, if I ever leave, the police will arrest me and put me in jail, and there's bad people in jail that could rape me, and other threat that they also, if we leave the situation, they're gonna report it to the police that we stole something from them, or, that we are illegal here, and, then also, the threat that, they will, do something to our family, those kind of threat, it make us, as a survivor, as a victim, stay in the situation no matter what, because we care about our family and we don't want to put our family in danger.
Ima, a lot of times in the media we hear about sex trafficking more than labor trafficking. What's your perspective on that?
Sex trafficking and labor trafficking is, it's the same thing. All form of trafficking is the same because we suffer the same thing, and labor and sex trafficking can be used over and over again. I remember the person who brought me here contact my trafficker that they want me back so they can sell me to other people. So it's the same thing, and the media should study, or they get education about all form of trafficking.
Now, Ima, you had mentioned that you and your friends had been exploited because of high recruitment fees and labor brokers outside the United States. What are your recommendations for how we can solve this problem in the United States today?
Well, as a survivor, and we all know that, we have to pay our debt and we have to pay for many years, and, I feel like that it should be the labor recruitment pay the recruitment fee, and also that, in order to stop, at least prevent, human trafficking, that before the individual coming to the United States or to other country to work, they have to have at least receive an information about, how to call help and about their rights, because when I came here, I didn't know about if I could call the police just by dialing 911. It's back home we don't have that. And also that that the trafficker need to face more consequences, or a punishment. They should be punished the same as other crime.
Ima, thanks so much for sharing your story and your expertise with us today. Julie, now back to you and our panelists.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thank you, Ima, again for such an important conversation. Holly, I want to get back to you and talk about IJM's work and your work to liberate slaves around the world, and what you've learned about the role of labor intermediaries in the situations that you've seen.
The vast majority of people in modern-day slavery, in bondage slavery today, are in South Asia. Some estimates are there are tens of millions of people in this situation, and we do have several offices that work with local government officials to locate people in bondage slavery, and it is real slavery. People can't leave. They're subject to horrible working conditions. They're subjected to violence, including sexual assault. And these are some of the world's poorest, most exploited people. The interesting variant in South Asia where these bonded slaves are, India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, is that there definitely is a labor intermediary, but the bonded slave does not pay money to the labor intermediary to get a job, as we saw in other examples, but rather the labor intermediary offers a very, very poor person a small loan. And then poor people who don't have access to credit from legitimate sources, if there's an illness in the family or a daughter getting married or a food shortfall, will take a loan sometimes for as small as $10 or $25, and then they owe the labor intermediary that money back, and they are literally within the control of that individual, and they are required to work off that debt. Now, here's the deal. If I owe you $25, Julie, I got to pay it back. I take that seriously. Everybody understands a debt's a debt, right? But I can go anywhere I want. I can do a job to pay off that debt. You don't own my person to pay off that debt. I just owe you the money. But in South Asia, in the countries that I mentioned, these unscrupulous individuals working hand in glove with industries that have notoriously poor labor rights conditions, such as rock quarries, brick kilns, rice mills. Conditions are terrible. People don't want to work in those places. That's one of the reasons they use this lure, this device of these loans to suck people in, and then they've got them. And we have clients that we have helped liberate from these conditions that have been in conditions of slavery for 25, 30 years. I remember one case that really touched my heart where there were 3 generations of people that were working off the debt of the previous generations. There was the grandparents, there were their children and their grandchildren, all working in a rice mill. They were never paid in money. They were only paid in rice, and they were not permitted to leave. And that is, by any definition, that's slavery.
Well, given that this is in some instances a generational problem and a problem that seems to be so entrenched, what can we do about this?
Well, it's not, I think it's a dodge to imagine this is a sort of cultural throwback to the caste system. Yes, there are some cultural factors that contribute to the millions of people that are in bondage slavery in Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. But the good news is that every one of these countries has laws against bondage slavery. In India, for example, there is excellent law, the Bonded Labor Abolition Act, that none of this behavior and none of this exploitation is remotely legal. And if the poorest of the poor, the Dalits, the people from the so-called scheduled castes, if they had access to advocates or had some way to have access to justice, there's no way it would be tolerated. The real problem is there's many of them, and in India, for example, where we work, the system for locating those individuals and putting them in touch with the benefits that are theirs, the generous benefits for people in slavery that are theirs under Indian law, just don't exist. So my organization helps work to put the victims in connection with those who can free them, the Indian government officials. We help train and teach government officials what the law actually is. We help bring them to these places. We work with the people inside the facilities to tell their stories. And once that happens, Indian law will take care of the rest. And we've seen in our own work with Indian government officials, 4,000 bonded slaves and their families come out of these conditions of really terrible slavery and servitude. Again, they're paying off tiny debts. Sometimes I think the whole system of bonded slavery almost depends on the integrity of these workers who want to pay off their debt, but they're charged for their food, they're charged for their shelter. It's like chattel slavery that we experienced in our own country. immediately after emancipation, where people can't leave because they end up owing more with every year. Their labor is virtually free. They end up owing more money than they ever contracted to pay back, and they have no way to pay it back.
Well, let me go to you, Sean, for a second to sort of ask the question. Holly was talking a lot about in South Asia, brick kilns and other sectors where this problem is most acute, with the labor brokers being instruments of slavery. What are the sectors worldwide where this is the biggest problem, including in the United States?
Mm-hmm. Actually, quite a few sectors. This is happening to people who are going into domestic service work. It's very big in construction, in places where you see a lot of cities going up, like in the Middle East, for example, but also construction here in the United States, Brazil, places like that. You also see it very, very prevalent throughout the agricultural sector, both for internal migrants and people going to other countries, certainly to this one where most of our crops are picked by migrant workers who face these kinds of circumstances that Neha and Holly have mentioned, where they have to pay somebody to get a job, or the conditions are very, very different from what they were promised. But also you see it in a lot of sectors, very sophisticated sectors like electronics, other consumer goods like toys and apparel, the making of household goods, furniture, things like that, wherever people are moving to find a job, going to where the jobs are, people are taking advantage of that need to find a job. And so what's really important is not to think of it only as being in some places, although as Holly mentions, it's a very big problem in South Asia, but to look at where these mechanisms exist. And so where there is a mechanism for people moving from one place to another for a job, you are going to find labor intermediaries, and among those, there's a great deal of exploitation because there's so little regulation, as Neha mentioned. But there are things that can be done from the government side, from the civil society side, from the union side, and certainly from the businesses who end up very often profiting from these circumstances.
Well, let me ask you, Neha, for a second. What are the regulatory schemes that exist in this country to try and address this problem?
Well, as I said earlier, Julie, there's actually not a lot in place right now to deal with this problem. We're actually advocating, as the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking attests, for greater regulation. The first thing that needs to be done for greater regulation is to provide full disclosure. Workers need to know the conditions that they're going to be working in, the salaries that are going to be paid, and if fees are going to be charged, the fees that are going to be allocated to them. We actually advocate for no fees. I mean, that should be the first thing. There should be regulations that say labor brokers are not allowed to charge fees to workers. Employers should have to pay those fees. If employers want to hire workers and want to use a labor intermediary, to bring in workers, the employer should bear the cost of those fees. We always say in the labor rights movement that you should not have to pay for the privilege of working. I work, you pay me. That's the way it's supposed to work. But in these conditions of slavery that we're hearing about now, workers have to pay to get a job, and that's the first thing that needs to end. And then, as I was saying, there needs to be full disclosure about the working conditions and the type of work that they're going to be doing, where, who the employer is going to be, etc. And then a very simple thing, and Ima mentioned this. I mean, these aren't big, difficult things that we're talking about. They're simple. Labor recruiters should have to register. We should know who the labor recruiters are. A worker should know, if they're going to be working for employer X, who are the labor recruiters that employer has hired to recruit for them, and so that they can be held, both the employer can be held accountable and the worker can know who they're going to be dealing with. And it's that simple. And then finally, there needs to be regulations that provide avenues for access to justice. That if a worker is in a situation of abuse, that there's criminal penalties against the labor recruiter and the employer holding them responsible, but that also that the worker can get back wages or repatriation, get a way to go home. There needs to be both criminal, civil, and administrative remedies to help these workers.
This seems an important theme that Ima talked about, Holly, Neha. Everybody's talking about access to justice, accountability, rule of law as kind of critical pieces for us to try and solve this problem. I want to get back to you, Holly, for a second. We talked about the problem being acute in South Asia and other parts of the world, Thailand. You've talked about a little bit what's happening in the U.S. What about when the U.S. government is acting abroad? How is this? Does this manifest itself there as well?
Well, I was shocked to learn fairly recently that the United States government, as a purchaser of labor, when we require people working on, say, our big military bases, take Iraq and Afghanistan, where we have a huge requirement for labor. The U.S. government, the Defense Department, the State Department, and other agencies contract with a handful of major labor procurers. Just a handful, 3. And they're American companies, and those companies then go through subcontractors, sometimes more than one level down the labor contracting chain. Those labor subcontractors work with local individuals to recruit foreign workers to work in yet another country. So let's talk about Iraq, where there was a large demand on the part of the U.S. government for workers, whether it's cooks or janitors or hairdressers, but you know, like defense installations are like little cities, I've heard someone say, and there's a large requirement for labor. And the United States secures individuals, men and women, from third countries. In the case of Iraq, we had a lot of people from Chennai, India, from the Philippines, from Nepal. I was interested to learn that a very large number of the third country nationals working for the U.S. government in Iraq were from Chennai, where my organization is based, and I was astounded to learn that working conditions of servitude and slavery were very similar for Indians who ended up working in Iraq. We had, and there is no accountability whatsoever. We have 69,000 or so individuals from third countries working for the U.S. government. So your tax dollars and mine are supposedly paying for this labor. But here's the bad news. They hardly get paid at all. And the money that the United States government provided to their major contractors doesn't go to the workers. A small fraction goes to the workers. It goes to these subcontractors who pocket a lot of that cash and, to add insult to injury, require the workers who want to have a good job to pay as well. So somebody's making a killing here, and I regret to inform you it's at the behest of our own government. Now, fortunately, this problem can really be solved, and I'm glad to tell you that there's some some real leaders, both Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate, who've set about to solve this problem. They've had a series of hearings. This is no longer a secret. There have been exposés. There have been superb testimony, and the solution is right at our fingertips if Congress would just act on it. And it is to basically make the prime contractors who get these large sums of money, make them responsible for the activity of their subs and those sub-subs. And once you hold that contractor accountable, and you have a real punishment associated with violations of clear standards, the U.S. government already has laws prohibiting trafficked slavery in our contracts. We need a mechanism to enforce that, and that's what laws in Congress that have just been introduced would do.
So, Sean, let me ask you one last question. Is this all about money?
Well, the reality is that money is needed by the workers just looking to get a decent job. But a lot of people are paying money to go to these labor brokers thinking that people are being recruited ethically, and they're not. And the reality is a few simple things can be done. Really open up to see if workers are being assessed these fees, which they shouldn't be. Are governments following and ratifying the ILO Convention 181 that governs this industry? Are people monitoring the labor brokers? Things like that. And are consumers holding companies accountable to make sure this isn't happening in their supply chains?
This has been such a rich conversation. I really wish we had more time, but unfortunately we don't. Thank you, Ema Matul, Holly Burkhalter of the International Justice Mission, Sean McDonald of Verite, and Neha Mishra of Solidarity Center. And thanks to Humanity United for making this gathering possible here in the Knight Studios at the Museum in Washington, D.C. We encourage you to learn more about slavery and trafficking by visiting the websites of the Alliance and our partner organizations. I'm Julie Fernandez. Goodbye for now.